afternoon, KCAA listeners, and good afternoon and good evening to those listening to us on the live stream link. This is the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm Kathleen, your host, and today we're going to have one of my frequent guests on the show, psychiatrist Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, and we're going to talk about two things. Dr. Welsing is going to give us her take, her analysis on two things. One, Donald Sterling's comments and the fact that yesterday Sterling made it clear that he's willing to fight. He and his wife are going to fight the decision by the NBA to ban him and fine him from the NBA because of his comments. So we're going to ask Dr. Welsing, we're going to ask for her analysis about Donald Sterling's comments. We're also going to discuss the mass murders that were perpetrated by Elliot Rodger on the UC Santa Barbara campus last Friday night. Elliot Rodger, I'm sure we all know about it. We're hearing it all on the news. Elliot Rodger killed 6 people, wounded 13 others, and then killed himself. You know, there's no doubt in that our society is a violent culture, is a violent society. Young men kill their fellow citizens and students with unnerving regularity in the United States. And Rodger left behind a detailed and clear-headed autobiography detailing his intense rage at women, the men with whom they choose to have sex and relationships with, and his own lack of sexual and romantic experience. You know, it's like I said, it's undeniable. It's a fact that we live in a violent culture. In fact, the earliest known mass shooting took place on school grounds in the United States back in the 18th century. On July 26, 1764, it was called the Pontiac Rebellion School Massacre. It entailed 4 Lenape American Indians who entered the schoolhouse near present-day Greencastle, Pennsylvania, shot and killed schoolteacher Enoch Brown, and killed 10 children. Only 3 children survived. So when you think about the first known school shooting or mass murder taking place by an Indian tribe, killing a schoolmaster and 10 children in the late 1700s, that's the 18th century. When we think about that history in the United States, how the United States got started, how her start was a violent start, taking away land from the American Indians, you know, we have to ask ourselves, is that violent start of America, is it written forevermore for America? Will that always be the way in which we conduct ourselves in this society? Is that something that is like, you know, in the blood, in the soil, in the sand, in the veins of America, violence? Because, you know, other cultures, other countries have guns, but they don't see the level of violence that we see in this country. I remember watching a documentary about John Adams, and he said and his wife, it was his wife, she said that the fact that slaves built the White House, no good can come from it. So, I mean, what I want to ask Dr. Welsing when I bring her on the phone, is there something about the spirit or the psyche or the psychology of a culture, of a country that cannot be changed? Because despite these mass shootings, we know that there's resistance or there's an inability to stop them. There's an inability to stop our violent culture. There's an inability to realize, there's an inability, when you think about Hollywood, like what percentage of the movies are all about violence? And yet our culture is mimicking, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is the culture mimicking Hollywood, or is Hollywood mimicking the culture? That's another thing I'm going to ask Dr. Welsing. So after the Lenape American Indian tribe in the late 1700s created that massacre in Greencastle, Pennsylvania. Then we can go to the 19th century. On September 28, 1850, in Westchester, Pennsylvania, at the Rocky Hill Schoolhouse, students found their young teacher, Rachel Sharpless, shot dead in the doorway of the school. George Farrell, 19 years old, shot her while hiding behind a tree as he was unlocking the door. As she was unlocking the door, he used a copy of the Saturday Evening Post in a wad to muffle the sound of the gun, where parts of the magazine were found at the scene and in his pockets. So, since Columbine, we all know that Columbine took place in April 1999, there have been 30 mass shootings in the United States. So let's, I'm not going to mention all 30, but let's just take a brief look at some of them. So we know that in April 1999, two teenage schoolboys shot and killed 12 schoolmates and a teacher at Columbine High School in Littletown, Colorado, before killing themselves. In July 1999, a stock exchange trader in Atlanta, Georgia, killed 12 people, including his wife and 2 children, before taking his own life. In September 1999, a gunman opened fire at a prayer service in Fort Worth, Texas, killing 6 people before committing suicide. In October 2002, a series of sniper-style shootings occurred in Washington, D.C., leaving 10 dead. In August 2003 in Chicago, a laid-off worker shot and killed 6 of his former workmates. In November 2004 in Birchwood, Wisconsin, a hunter killed 6 other hunters and wounded 2 others after an argument with them. In March 2005, a man opened fire at a church service in Brookfield, Wisconsin, killing 7 people. In October 2006, a truck driver killed 5 schoolgirls and seriously wounded 6 others in a school in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, before taking his own life. In April 2007, student Sung-Yoon Chow shot and killed 32 people and wounded 15 others at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia, before shooting himself, making it the deadliest mass shooting in the United States after 2000. Because prior to 2000, you remember when I said our history is steeped in violence. The soil of the United States is dripping with the blood of those mass shootings starting back in the late 1700s. I mean, I think this is relevant. I think this, we got to know our history. We're a violent culture. We can't deny it. Anyone that denies that doesn't know our history. In August 2007, 3 Delaware State University students were shot and killed in execution style by a 28-year-old and 2 15-year-old boys. In September 2007, a freshman student at Delaware State University shot and wounded 2 other students at a campus dining hall. In December 2007, a 20-year-old man killed 9 people and injured 5 others in a shopping center in Omaha, Nebraska. In December 2007, a woman and her boyfriend shot dead 6 members of her family on Christmas Eve in Carnation, Washington. In February 2008, a shooter who is still to this day at large tied up and shot 6 women at a suburban clothing store in Chicago, leaving 5 of them dead and the remaining 1 injured. In February 2008, a man opened fire in a lecture hall at Northern Illinois University in DeKalb, Illinois, killing 5 students and wounding 16 others before laying down his weapon and surrendering. In July 2008, a former student shot 3 people in a computer lab at St. Mountain Community College in Phoenix, Arizona. As I said, I'm not going to go through all 30 since Columbine. We're going to take a break right now. When we come back from the break, we're going to be joined by my guest, Dr. Cress Welsing, and she's going to give us some insight into these mass murders. Also, at the end of the show, I'm going to ask her about Donald Sterling's comment. So we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kathleen Wells Show. I was just listening, let's see, since 1999, since Columbine, there have been 30 mass shootings. We're going to be joined now by Dr. Cress Welsing, who is a frequent guest on my show. She's a psychiatrist who utilizes a unified theory of psychiatry. She is the author, a noted author of the Cress theory of color confrontation, which explores the practice of white supremacy, and she's the author of the ISIS papers, the keys to the color. So, Dr. Welsing, what can I ask you? Are we a violent culture? That's my first question.
Well, Kathleen, I would like to start with looking at Elliot Rodger, the recent shooting, because I think that there's some very significant things that seem to be overlooked that can give us some insight. And by that, when I looked at this young man, I saw a person who was non-white, meaning he might be mixed race, and then I understand that the father was white and the mother was Asian. Then I looked at what he said, and tragically, he was angry with blonde women because they seemed to reject him. Now, I don't hear anything about race being talked about as the newspapers look at this case, but race is clearly obvious to me. And I wonder why it is being ignored. I mean, to me, it's the biggest thing in the case. Looking at this young man and looking at all the images that are on television, we're not looking at the face of a customary white person. And how many people at the university, how many white males have 3 Asian roommates? I would imagine that there may be none. And so he's right in the midst of a group of Asians, yet the race factor in the case is being completely neglected and ignored. And so my thought was, and one of the things that I saw in an interview that he said, I wanted to be loved, I wanted to be adored, and I wanted to be accepted. And so what actually is the experience of an Asian person or any other classified non-white person in a system of racism, white supremacy? You see, as long as that is being ignored, I mean, people go forward, and some of the news people have talked about the misogyny, and he hated women. What has been this person's experience from childhood? If he's the only, like just looking at the student body at the university, I've looked at, of course, I haven't seen all of the pictures, but I don't see hardly any non-white people at the university. How many black people? Maybe there are a number of Asians who are at the university. But if they were interviewed, would they say that they are completely accepted by white people? And so the issue is, what has been this young man's experience from childhood in a predominantly white culture? And I go back to a CNN presentation, Anderson Cooper, where he was talking about when do children learn about race. And he had 3-year-old white children given strips with the same face but different complexions from white to black. And a 3-year-old white child is if you said, well, what one do you dislike? And the child immediately at age 3 points to a black person, a person of color. And so as long as we are ignoring that we have a system not of democracy, that might be the goal, but we don't have a system of democracy. We have a system of racism, white supremacy. And so the pain, let's say that we do find out that if it's factual, that he has an Asian parent, and so therefore he had some of the genetic characteristics of a non-white person. And so, if so, how has he been treated? How has he been related to by children and adults in a predominantly white setting? And so that's very, very painful. I was talking to a patient in my office yesterday who's black, and she was talking about her experience as a young child in a predominantly white private school where there were 500 students and 4 blacks. And she was talking about the pain and the rejection that she experienced. Now, this rejection is violence against that child, the violence that comes in a system of racism towards non-white people. This is what we have to be able to look at. Now, then beyond that, understanding, well, where does the gun fit in? In my thesis, and I have an essay in the ISIS papers, talking about the importance of the gun. I say that the gun is a substitute, well, how can I say it briefly? People who classify themselves as white are fewer than 1/10 of the people on the planet. The vast majority of people are people with skin color, black, brown, red, and yellow. The white population is a genetic recessive population in terms of skin coloration. My thesis about racism is that there is a deep fundamental fear, the most fundamental fear in the white population, local, national, global, is fear of white genetic annihilation. And everything that is done within the culture is to ensure white genetic survival. Now, this is never, ever talked about. But the gun is the weapon that has been developed in the white culture to prevent white genetic annihilation. In other words, the gun is the answer to anxiety and fear in this culture. And so if one wants to understand why there cannot be gun control, like anybody listening to one of the parents, I think Martinez, the father crying and talking about the tragedy that there cannot be gun control, that until this culture begins to understand and confront the issue of race, and therefore racism, the problems that exist in the culture cannot be solved. I gave a paper last year at the National Medical Association section on psychiatry, and I said black psychiatrists used to say that racism, white supremacy was the number one mental health problem in this entire society. But my paper last year said the denial of racism, white supremacy is the number one mental health problem. So we're talking about guns, we're talking about mental illness, and we're talking about racism. All of these things are tied together. We've just gone through the whole discussion about Donald Sterling and his racism remarks. Before that, it was a sheriff talking about blacks were better off or would be better off being slaves. Mm-hmm. Just after that, we had the New Hampshire sheriff calling the president a nigger. Mm-hmm. This culture is about race, and even if we look at the word America itself, as an anagram within that word is the phrase, I am race. Mm-hmm.
So and Elliot Rodger himself...
Excuse me?
I'm saying Elliot Rodger himself talked about race in his manifesto. He talked about, well, I'm half white, and yet this black guy, he called him like a filthy black, so he brought race up himself. And yet the media...
Now, see, what is significant? He brought race up, but none of the reporters have talked about race, meaning that it's just like a big elephant in the room. Mm-hmm. And instead of focusing clearly on the issue of race, there is the complete and total denial and avoidance of the biggest thing in the picture.
Right. And we know when you avoid something, there's a problem.
Exactly. In other words, whether it's conscious and or subconscious avoidance, but it is avoidance nonetheless. And if it's subconscious, there's a conscious awareness, I need to stay away from this issue.
Mm-hmm. Everyone in the media, everyone on TV, on radio, cannot discuss it. And in fact, Eric Holder said that we are a nation of cowards because we do not discuss race.
Exactly.
And everyone is saying that Rodger, he's mentally ill, but they can't discuss race.
Exactly. Yeah. The mental illness, just like the paper I gave in Toronto last year, that the denial of the dynamic of racism, white supremacy is America's number one mental health problem. Mm-hmm. And the gun is critical. It's just like when a black man was elected president of the United States. What took place? The massive purchasing of guns. Mm-hmm. Even calling it the Obama effect. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you see? So it's the avoidance of focusing on the issue and the dynamic of racism, white supremacy, which I say is a total system for white genetic survival. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But as long as it cannot talk about this, but at the same time, there's constant killing all around. The killings that you talk about, where we look at an individual has used a gun. Mm-hmm. All of these individual murderers. But the system itself is producing this kind of behavioral response. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The gun is the answer to solving whatever is perceived as a problem.
Exactly.
Whether it's at Afghanistan or Iraq, or wherever it is, the gun is the answer in Western culture. And so not only do we see it throughout the so-called entertainment world. If you turn on the television, do you see it's murder, 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 murder. Mm-hmm. Killing, videos. Killing. Mm-hmm. And it's called entertainment, but there's no understanding or the failure to look at, well, what is this connected to? And all of that is tied to the inability to actually look at and confront and keep the gaze focused on the issue of racism as white supremacy.
Yeah, they discuss everything but that. They always go to the default position, he's mentally ill.
But and the screaming and the hysteria, calling him a killer. Yes, he is troubled. Now, he's been in psychiatry, in having psychiatric treatment for a good part of his life. Now, my question, I'm a general psychiatrist and a child psychiatrist. I would say that the issue that this, because he's obviously a clearly very intelligent individual, but he has major emotional issues that I say, until proven otherwise, are tied to race, just like the mass murder at Virginia Tech. An Asian, do you see, who talked about being bullied. See, so people who classify themselves as white have to look at how do they relate to people who are classified as non-white. See, we got to remember, Asians were put in concentration camps in California.
Well, we know race is an issue because he raised it. He raised it.
And
he raised it. And the fact that people ignore that.
And the fact that it's right in your face.
It's right in your face.
See, it's no different than Donald Sterling, who was spewing all of the racism. And then what did he say? I'm not a racist.
Exactly.
Do you see? And it's all of the people who are pointing, all the people who pointed at Donald Sterling and said, you know, he's a racist. What about their attitude? Because all you have to do is turn on the television and look at the news, and you're seeing basically white, 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 white,
right,
white, 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 white. Why is it white, 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 white?
Right, but the thing of it is, white people don't realize that that's all you see. Do you know what I'm saying? I don't know if they do consciously or not. But when
see, that's why in my definition, I say consciously and or subconsciously determined. See, patterns of perception. I'm going to read my definition, Kathleen.
Okay.
Racism, white supremacy, is the local and global power system and dynamic structured and maintained by persons who classify themselves as white, whether consciously or subconsciously determined, which consists of patterns of perception, logic, symbol formation, thought, speech, action, and emotional response, as conducted simultaneously in all areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war, for the ultimate purpose of white genetic survival and to prevent white genetic annihilation on planet Earth, a planet upon which the vast and overwhelming majority of people are classified as non-white, black, brown, red, and yellow, by white-skinned people, and all of the non-white people are genetically dominant in terms of skin coloration compared to the genetic recessive white-skinned people. So these patterns of perception, consciously and or subconsciously determined. And the very fact that race, the most obvious thing in this case, in his manifesto, is not talked about. So the mental illness, the mental illness is in the culture, the white culture itself. And Elliot Rodger is the victim of the violence of racism, and then he acts out tragically. And the first people he killed were 3 Asian young men.
Now, what is that significant?
Because he rejects. See, in other words, I could have been white like my father had it not been for my Asian mother. And this is the dilemma of the first-degree mixed-race child in a system of racism, white supremacy. But so the culture is white supremacy. And this is why everybody learns if you're black, get back, brown, stick around, yellow, mellow. White, right. This is a color code for white genetic survival.
And what is also relevant and significant to me, although in his manifesto he talked about, he specifically named a black guy getting white girls. He goes to the sorority where they're white girls, as opposed to taking out his rage on a black guy for getting a white girl. Do you understand what I mean?
And now say that again.
In other words, he was angry that white girls with blonde hair would prefer to date and have relations with a black guy over him.
Right, because he's lighter.
Exactly.
You see what I'm saying? I mean, it's just in the entire colored world that has been formed by racism, white supremacy. Everybody is, wanting to be white. And so if you are lighter, you're supposed to be more beautiful than a darker person.
Mm-hmm.
And so in his mind, why would the white girl go out with me and not go out with an Asian, a person who is less dark? Do you see? But the white female in the system of racism says her ideal mate is tall, dark, and handsome. Just like the white male says he's not a man until he's had sex with a black woman.
Oh, really?
And I say that is related to the subconscious desire to be able to produce color, because white skin is a mutation. It's a genetic mutation from black.
Oh, I didn't know that the white man said he's not a man until he has sex with a black woman.
Oh, yes. I don't know how young you are, but everybody else in the world knows that.
I'm not that young, but we're going to discuss.
Okay.
We're going to take a break, but when we come back, I want to touch on that, and also I want to give out the phone number. Our toll-free number is having a snafu, so let me give out this number, 909-888-5288. If you have a comment or question for Dr. Welsing, please call 909-888-5288. And when we come back from the break, I'm going to have to ask her, what is this about a white man is not a man until he has sex with a black woman? I've never heard it. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm speaking with a frequent guest on my show, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, and she is the author of the ISIS Papers, the Keys to the Colors. And we're talking about Elliot Rodger's mass murder, his massacre last Friday in Santa Barbara. And we're talking about how race is significant, and yet the media is ignoring it. So tell me, Dr. Welsing, about this, a white man is not a man until he slept with a black woman. What's that about?
Well, again, I think because, black people are the mothers and fathers of everybody on the planet. The first human beings are black. And white people, white-skinned people, this is albinism. And they're genetic mutations from black people. And just like white people want to tan, they really whoosh deep, deep down inside that they had colored skin. I mean, it's just like looking at all of the people, at least on the East Coast. The women who are giving the news, they all have this orange paint on them to darken themselves. Do you see? So in spite of the overt teaching that the more color you have, the uglier you are, whites themselves are desirous of having skin color, but they don't because they are mutations from black people. And so the desire to produce color, the desire to produce a product of color, which was done massively during formal slavery, do you see? And even now, there is high-level miscegenation despite all of the disclaimers to the contrary. And so this is, a white male told me, Dr. Welsing, do you know what white men say? And I said, no, I don't. He said, white men say they're not men until they've had sexual relations with a black woman, because the standard is the black male. That's just like standard dress. When white people want to be dressed up, the most sophisticated dress is to have on black.
Well, I never knew that white men said that. So speaking of white men, let's talk about briefly.
See, and that really is, if we had a lot of time to talk, That's the symbolism in the game of golf. It's just like basketball and football are symbolic acts of white women having sexual relations with black men. You have a black ball, a brown ball going into, read the ball games chapter in the ISIS papers. You see, you have a brown ball going into white upright legs in football, and a brown ball going into a white net, and white females in short skirts dancing on the side, and a whole audience of white males who are voyeurs looking on.
Well, this symbolism is relevant and powerful, and it reflects our unconscious mind. Is that
exactly correct? See, things that people don't deal with consciously can tunnel down in the brain, in the subconscious, but they will be expressed. You see, it's just like Donald Sterling. All of the things that came out of his mouth, even his statement of being jealous of black men and not wanting a female that he wanted to think of as white. You see, but she had black ancestry. Which she said, like, I'm black and Mexican, or black and Hispanic. Well, why can't you just be a white female? You see, but he talked about his jealousy of black. See, this has a lot to do with black men, the war against black men, and racism, white supremacy it's war against black people in general and black men in particular, because blacks have the greatest genetic potential to cause white genetic annihilation. And so all the black men who are killed by police officers or beaten up by police officers, and the statement made, I thought he had a weapon. And the black male may not have a weapon. In many cases, no weapon. But the weapon, subconsciously perceived and understood, is the genital apparatus, where that can cause white genetic annihilation. And this is why if you looked at a lateral view of the male genitalia where you have testicle phallus, and you turn that around 90 degrees, you see a gun. And it's called the great equalizer. See, in other words, you have a genital apparatus that can cause my genetic annihilation, and the brain computer will say, must create weapon, can do same thing. And that's the gun. And that's why the gun cannot be controlled. Now, it could be controlled if the American culture wanted to engage in get rid of its mental illness, which is the denial of racism. If the American culture wanted to deal with that and bring that discussion forward so that people can benefit. It's just like, I'm in my office right now working with patients and helping them confront the issues that are causing problematic behavior. See, before psychiatry became pharmaceutical psychiatry, then we talked about the dynamics controlling and influencing behavior. And we were taught the role of the psychiatrist is to help people face reality, even when they are afraid to do so. Do you see? And so the denial of racism is what this culture has been about from its inception.
So,
from the mass murder of the Native American.
Exactly.
To the enslavement of Africans. Continuous to the present, where, we are supposed to have had emancipation, we are supposed to have had desegregation of schools, and 50 years later, we find we have segregated schools.
Exactly.
Or we're supposed to have civil rights, And all of that, or we're supposed to have the right to vote, and all of that is being turned upside down.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see? So the question, the mentally healthy question would be, just like the mentally healthy question would be, why is it that we have this problem with guns? Why is it that we have problems between people who classify themselves as white and the people that they classify as non-white? See, even Albert Einstein talked about racism. It's a book called Albert Einstein, or Einstein on Race and Racism, where he talks about white supremacy. But that part of his work has been suppressed. You see, so when people talk about Einstein and they talk about physics and his equation E equals mc squared, relativity, but they don't talk about his comments on race and racism.
Oh, I want to get that. But also I want to ask you, I have two questions. We only have, 5 more minutes? One question I want to ask you is that why, I see that people don't understand the definition of racism. You gave your definition. A lot of white people are concerned with reverse racism. Explain. I know there's no such thing. And also I saw on my Facebook page where a woman said that the Irish experienced racism. So what is my question to you? Do I want to ask you what is the epistemology of race? Where does that word come from?
Where does what come from?
Racism, the word racism. Is it intended? Why would
See, in other words, people of color on the planet don't go around talking about this is Western, this is white thinking. And as I said, my definition, in other words, if we understand racism not as a pejorative, but racism is the awareness of skin coloration. And that is in the minds of people who classify themselves as white.
Mm-hmm.
And they realize that they can be genetically annihilated. In other words, if on the emancipation, Abraham Lincoln emancipated the enslaved Africans. And so if at that point there was a decision, okay, we are emancipating the enslaved people, and now they can mix throughout the society and no one is going to focus on color, then there would have been white genetic annihilation. It's just Dr. Martin Luther King. If he said everybody should love, but if that love is translated in terms of sex and everybody was mixing sexually, because white skin is a genetic recessive trait. That's why we have President Obama. His mother's white. The father is black. We don't see his mother when we look at him because white is a genetic recessive trait. This is just fundamental genetics. This is not Dr. Cress Welsing's theory of genetics. Dominance and recessive is fundamental genetics. And so if there is going to be white survival on the planet, there has to be mass murder of people of color. So we've just been in a 10-year war in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, killing who? Non-white people by people who classify themselves as white. You see, they can call it terrorism or whatever. The fundamental terrorism is racism, white supremacy. You see, that has to kill its perception that it has to kill for white genetic survival. And so having to kill puts the gun, the flag could just have a gun on it and say this is essential for white survival. But even the flag, see, if one looks at the flags in Western culture, the flag is symbolically a phallus and a testicle, lateral view. And so the flag, the cloth part of the flag, red, white, and blue, stands for white skin through which you can see red arterioles and blue veins. And the whole discussion about blue blood blue jeans.
Mm-hmm. Well, are you
so if people wanted, in other words, I maintain any problem that can be perceived can be solved if there is actual intention to solve it. The whole question about guns, the whole question about race, all of that can be looked at and understood if there is a willingness as opposed to the determination to block any discussion in depth about what racism is really all about, what the obsession with guns is really all about on the part of the people who classify themselves as white, who control the media. The system is white-dominated.
There's the music. So, I'm going to have to let you go, but we'll have you back on, Dr. Welsing. I really appreciate you being
I commend you for opening up another level of discussion.
You know I'll have you back on. Thank you very much. I'll see you next week on the Kathleen Wells Show. Thank you, Dr. Welsing.
Bye now.